So, second slide. Okay, so why does this matter? So it matters because it's in the Bible and it's tied to prophecy. God has a plan for Israel in the future. Romans 11 reminds us that in the New Testament, that Israel is going to be used by the Lord mightily in the future again, and it's going to be like the centerpiece of what God does in the world in the end times. Also, it's on your campus if you're a college student, especially if you're in the secular colleges, but even in the Christian ones, there's a lot of debate about, like, there's the BDS movement, that's like the pro-Palestinian movement, and then there's the Israel on Campus Coalition, that's the pro-Israel side of things, and that's like a really hot-button issue. And it's just a top issue of our time in general, too, is in the news all the time. And it's also a major prayer need too, because there's a lot of elements to this. There's Israel and Israel needing prayer, and then there's also Christians in the region who are impacted as well. So next slide. So I want to contrast what's going on now in Israel to what we learn about in like in the Old Testament. We learn about Israel's wars, but Israel's wars are against basically the Canaanites, and the Canaanites have all these subgroups to them. We have the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and Jay Vernon McGee used to always, like, when there'd be the list of that, he'd always end it with "and the electric lights," because it's just like so many ites. But so those ites, God told Israel to destroy those peoples, and it's the only time that God ever required that to take place, where a people group was to be entirely wiped out. And the reason for that is because Jesus wouldn't have been able to come otherwise, because they would have either opposed Israel or they would have corrupted Israel so much. And but these people groups are no longer in existence today. They may still be in the DNA of some people in the Middle East if you did like a really exhaustive search and tried to find, like, all way back, maybe you might find like someone's like 1% Canaanite or something, I don't know. But there's not really, these people groups don't exist as nations or as identifiable ethnic groups today. So the current conflict doesn't really have to do with that, even though it's a lot of the same places. Next slide. Okay, so this is what the current conflict does have to do with, and this is in Genesis, and what this is about here is Abraham was promised that Jesus was going to come through his line, and that God was going to make a great nation out of Abraham that would bless the world. And Abraham took it into his own hands to try to make that happen, and he had relations with Hagar, which is like a servant lady that he had, and from that came Ishmael. And Abraham was thinking that Ishmael was going to be how this promise would come about, and the Lord told Abraham that God did have a plan for Ishmael and his descendants, but that it would be through Isaac that the promise would happen. And Isaac is the forefather of the Jewish people. Ishmael is the forefather of the Arab people. So God does have a plan for the Arabs, but the land of Israel specifically, if you read through the scripture, the land of Israel is supposed to be to the Jew. So next slide. Okay, so how did Israel end up scattered throughout the world, like they to some extent still are today, because there are still Jewish communities all over the world? How did that come about? Well, it came about primarily a little bit after Jesus' time. When Jesus was on the earth, Israel was still in the land of Israel. They still had that land. They were under Roman control, but they still dwelled in the land that God had given them in the Old Testament. And then several decades after Jesus' resurrection, there was a revolt where the Jews wanted to escape from under Roman rule, and the Romans responded to that by defeating the Jews and destroying the temple in Jerusalem and basically all of Jerusalem. And that's the beginning of, in the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus talks about the end times. He begins by talking about what would happen, and he said about how the Romans would destroy the city, and that occurred. And after that time, Israel there were still some Jews who were in Israel, but very few. And basically, Israel ended up being what they call the diaspora, like scattered throughout the world. So next slide. So modern Israel came about basically a little over 100 years ago, before Before Israel became a nation, it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, which was Turkish, Muslim. They ruled the whole Middle East. The Middle East, as we know it, didn't really exist until about 100 years ago. It was basically all under like one big umbrella. And then in World War I, the Ottoman Empire crumbled, and the area ended up under British control because the British defeated the Ottoman Empire. And the Jews were persecuted all over the world at that time, and Britain saw a benefit in letting the Jews return to their ancient homeland, because the idea was this would be a place where they could live in safety and not be persecuted. And so in 1917, Britain made a proclamation allowing Jews to return to Israel. Next slide. Okay, so here, this was the plan originally in modern times. You can see basically all of Israel from the Jordan River westward was supposed to be open to the Jews, and the area to the east was supposed to be for the Arabs. And it's been pointed out that the idea of a Palestinian state, in the sense that there is a Palestinian state, because the Palestinians are Arabs, and they have a lot of area that they can live in, most notably Jordan, but also the other surrounding countries. And this was enforced by Britain for a period of nearly 30 years. And Britain had a mandate from what was the predecessor of the United Nations. It was called the League of Nations at that time. And because there was that mandate, this period is actually called Mandatory Palestine. And I heard that term actually for the first time a couple weeks ago, and I didn't know that the word mandatory could be used that way, but I found that out. But even under this system, there were revolts because the Arabs did not want to let the Jew inhabit their ancient homeland. And so there were two big Arab revolts. And the Jews accepted this. The Jews did not want more land than this. They accepted it to be this way, but the Arabs didn't. Next slide. Okay, and then this is also just an aside that during that time when Britain was in charge, there was a lot of agricultural activity going on in Israel, and particularly a lot of citrus agriculture. And there are certain links between our area, which was also like all citrus groves at that time, and Israel being under citrus cultivation. And some of this I have actually looked into myself when I worked at the Smiley Library, but I would like to do more research on this as well. I do know that the Jaffa oranges were the big type of orange that was grown in Israel and exported. And a lot of the early Jewish settlers, they were citrus farmers. And some of them followed what they call the California model, where they were actually looking at the Inland Empire and how we did citrus out here, and they were using that as a model. But also it seems to have been like both ways too. It seems like the citrus growers out here were looking at them as a model too. So it's just kind of interesting, something to do more research on, but that's just an aside. So next slide. Okay, so this is the date that probably most young people who grow up in a Christian environment, they probably know this date by heart, May 14, 1948. It's very emphasized. That's when Israel actually became a nation in the sense of declaring independence. And in that picture there, the speaker is David Ben-Gurion. He was the first prime minister of modern Israel. And he's considered to be the kind of like the founding father of Israel in modern times. And there's their flag, and that's the Star of David that Pastor Jeff was mentioning. Next slide. So I'm just going to briefly go over some of the wars of modern Israel, because we go over a lot of their ancient wars in the Bible, but they've had a lot of wars that they fought in the last 100 years too. And their first one was actually with independence, because when they became a nation, the Arab countries around them attacked them immediately. And the first war was a war for independence. This was just a war for them to even survive as a nation. And the worst part of it was like a month or two, but in some respects it lasted like a year or more. And they were left with, at the end, after the war, they were left with basically what they have today, minus the West Bank, Gaza, and like all those disputed territories. So next slide. So their next war was in 1956, and this was actually the most international of any of the wars that Israel has fought in modern times. And what happened here was the Suez Canal was involved, and Egypt was involved, and Egypt did blockades to try to hurt Israel's economy, but that also impacted the global economy too, because the Suez Canal is a lot of how trade happens between Asia and Europe, and so because of that, France and Britain were also involved in this one, and Israel won this war. Of course, Israel's basically won all of their wars. Next slide. So this is the most important Arab-Israeli war, other than the War for Independence, would be the Six-Day War of 1967. This is where Israel really expanded its territory. They captured East Jerusalem, which has a lot of prophetic significance because they captured the area that used to be the temple. They also captured the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, even all that Sinai Peninsula. They don't have that anymore, but they captured a lot of territory. And this was really basically miraculous that this occurred. And Israel was greatly outnumbered at that time, and yet in just 6 days, just a period of 1 week, they defeated all their enemies and doubled or tripled their territory. Next slide. So the Yom Kippur War in 1973, this was the costliest victory that Israel's had in modern times. They didn't gain any land. They defeated their enemies, but they didn't gain any new land. But it had a high rate of loss of life among Israel. Next slide. So here's the Lebanon War of 1982, and what this had to do with was Lebanon had a big civil war that was going on, and a lot of that was internal within Lebanon, and a lot of that didn't really impact Israel, but some of it did because there were terrorist groups in Lebanon that were a threat to Israel, and so Israel got involved in that. And this has kind of remained that Israel has several fronts where they fight today. One of them is Lebanon, and they're fighting the terrorist group Hezbollah. Is always a danger to them from the north, and that's really when that began, was 82. Next slide. Okay, so those were the major wars up until very recent times, which I'll mention in a second. But I also want to contrast these wars with intifadas. So intifadas are uprisings that the Palestinians do against Israel. The wars don't last very long because Israel has a very modern military, and Israel's military pretty much just defeats. When enemies come against them, they defeat them within usually a month or less. Israeli wars don't last years; they last weeks mostly. Intifadas, though, are uprisings by Palestinians, and these can go on for years, and they take a different form. There's not really the Israeli military isn't able to defeat them as much. What happens here is in these situations, Palestinians will do terrorist attacks or riots or different types of unrest. And the worst of those was in the early 2000s. And so for me or people my age, you may remember this a little bit, or if you're really young, this was what was going on when you were born. This was in the news all the time. It was a top story every day in the early 2000s. There'd be suicide bombings, and it was just all constant. And a lot of people thought that one was going to actually last kind of semi-permanently, but it kind of slowly died out, and it became a little bit calmer anyway. Next slide. Okay, so the 2006 Lebanon War, this was a war primarily against Hezbollah, and this was, Hezbollah fired a lot of rockets into Israel at that time. And this was in the last 20 years, this was probably the worst that it got in Israel. Next slide. Okay, so the Gaza wars, this is what's been going on in the last 15 years. All the wars that Israel has fought have all been based in Gaza. And it's interesting because Gaza is the land of the Philistines, and in the Old Testament, the most stubborn enemy that Israel faced, the one that they never were really able to defeat, were the Philistines. But of course, these are not the Philistines, so these are Arabs who live there. And this has kind of been the conflict this past month was the fourth one in Gaza. And Israel wins these in the sense that the rocket fire from the terrorists in Gaza stops, but it doesn't really seem to have like a definitive end. It restarts again, and we've been in this holding pattern basically ever since like 2008. Next slide. Okay, so I have a couple of information sources I wanted to share, and these are good too if you're doing a report in school, or if there's like an opportunity to do a report that could somehow have to do with Israel. Here's some good avenues of maybe looking into that. The first is, this is more academic. This is the Jewish Virtual Library. And this is from a pro-Israel perspective, but it's very well researched, and it has like maps and information and everything for all of their wars. So if you were doing a report and you wanted to reference like a good source, but it's like a pro-Israel source, that would be a good one. And if anyone needs this slide to stay for a little bit longer, just to like write down the URL or anything, raise your hand. Okay, next slide. And then this would be more like just for news. If you want to take a break from all our partisan news, because in the US the news is all just like Democrats versus Republicans, if you want to learn about something else going on that maybe has some more biblical significance, you can look up jpost.com, maybe add to your favorites. This is probably the most prominent Israeli news source. And it's like a centrist perspective, because Israel has a lot of different viewpoints. There's liberal Jews, there's conservative Jews, there's more like middle of the road, and they have a lot of different views on how they should relate to the Palestinians and even how they should run their own country. Jerusalem Post is kind of considered kind of middle of the road, so it kind of like covers a little bit of like all the sides, and it's not like overtly partisan. And then also, just as an aside, kind of a little bit more back to like the academic type of topics. So there's some interesting topics also that someone could study also would be Golda Meir. She was Israel's only woman prime minister. So if you ever have an opportunity to study like women in history, or you want to do a report about like a famous woman in history, she would be an interesting one you could look into. And I also saw too that Theodore Herzl, who was like the journalist who first started to cover the issue of Jews returning to Israel. He was a Jew himself, and he became like a supporter of Jews returning to Israel back in the 1800s before anyone else really brought that up. And he actually wrote a resource called The Jewish State, and it's been republished. I saw that today. It's been republished in English, and it's just like a little booklet, and it's kind of the first time that in modern times that there was like a big push to go back to Israel, and he kind of like spearheaded that a little bit, like intellectually and all that. And so that would be an interesting, like, if you ever have an opportunity to do a book report or whatever, that could be interesting to look at. So next slide. Okay, so a topic that we don't usually hear about too much, the focus is usually on Israeli versus Palestinian Arab, but there's also the Palestinian Christians too. And Palestinian Christians have been around since Acts 2:11, because in the story of the book of Pentecost, or in the story of Pentecost, in the book of Acts, it says that Arabs were among the people who came to faith at the birth of the church. And these were Arabs that were living in the area of Israel. And so Arabs in Israel who are Christians, actually they go back a long way, because Islam didn't start until the 600s. So really, Arabs have a longer relationship with Christianity than they do with Islam. And there aren't that many Palestinian Christians around today in the land, because it's very dangerous, because not only is there all the fighting going on with Israel and all that, but there's also their fellow Arabs who are Muslim hate them. And it would be very dangerous to be an Arab Christian in a like Palestinian controlled area of the Holy Land. And so many Palestinian Christians have immigrated from there, and some of them are even in the US or in other countries or elsewhere in the Middle East. But definitely we should pray for them, and because they are really the Christian presence in that part of the world, and they're declining very rapidly. Next slide. Okay, and then this is just kind of a trivia here of who are the only U.S. presidents who have not been in office during an Arab-Israeli war. Now, obviously, there's always been Arab-Israeli conflicts going on, but like as far as like a full-fledged war, who's never had to deal with that? There's only been 3 of them. 2 of them didn't serve a complete term, and that's one of the reasons, because their time in office was so short. Kennedy was assassinated, Ford took over when Nixon resigned. But then Donald Trump was the first president who served a complete 4-year term who did not have to deal with an Arab-Israeli war happening on his watch. And so with these 3 men, we will never really know how they would have handled an Arab-Israeli conflict because they never really got to. So, next slide. Okay, so here's something that we can do for Israel, and Pastor Jeff will come up and lead a prayer on this. But this is David in Psalm 122, and he's talking about praying for the peace of Jerusalem, and this is true for all time. And we're to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, but also Paul tells us in Romans 10 that we're also to pray for that his prayer for Israel is that they be saved. And the reason why he prays that is because even among the Jews, there's only a very small minority that is following the Lord, even according to the Old Testament. There's Jews by ethnicity, but as far as like being Orthodox Jew, like really following the Old Testament, it's a tiny percentage. It's a growing percentage, but it's a small percentage, and so we should pray for them spiritually as well as their physical needs.
Yep, and I'm going to ask Daniel to open in prayer, but I was thinking, since the Bible tells us to do this, so you can do it, that, we'll do that. There's that Psalm 122, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and it is kind of funny, like the meme, they're going to have these struggles, they're going to have these problems, and we know that. But it doesn't mean we can't pray for their peace, and especially like Daniel's saying, the priests, and like Paul prayed that they would be saved. His heart's desire and prayer for God for Israel is that they would be saved, and that's how we can have peace. And like I was praying earlier, like the peace that we have should just overflow to all the people around us, to all the people in the world, just to reach all the nations. And this whole presentation, the goal of this is not to get you to take a side or switch sides. Jesus isn't even on either side. Even like when Joshua, I keep referring back to this, but when Joshua ran into Jesus, when he was scouting out the land, and he was told to go attack them and kill all the Canaanites, Joshua saw Jesus. He didn't know it was him. It was a pre-incarnate Christ, and he's like, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" Like while he's pointing his arrow at him, or his bow, and he says, "Neither." But I'm here as commander of the armies of the Lord. And so God has a plan for Israel, and we need to know that, and that's why there is so much support for Israel. They're kind of like our family in a way. It says they're beloved for the sake of the fathers. They gave us the Bible, but they also were the chief persecutors of the Christians, the first Christians, and still today they persecute Christians. So we don't want you to take a side, or tonight the goal isn't to take a side as we talk about it, but it's to get a clear picture of what's going on. There's an insidious evil over there, and it's called Islam. And I will take a side against that, because Islam, we lived in Kosovo for 15 years, half the time, and they were all Muslim. And they had actually been taken over by the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire that was driven to take over the world by the belief in Allah and the Quran, to convert everyone that they conquer with the sword, or to subject them, and make them pay taxes. And that's why you still have Christians over there, because they actually were willing to pay high taxes. But Islam spread by force. It was a mandate from God in their religion to kill Christians and Jews and anyone who won't convert to Islam. And that remains there today. And Muslims in our country, and maybe we could talk about this more after, but I think it maybe helps for the prayer time. But Muslims even in the West and in Western countries, democratic countries, they will give you the idea that Islam is peaceful, And that's actually what's left out of a lot of the presentations about this conflict, is that inside Islam, it's basically their commitment by the core belief of like honoring Allah, that they need to take back that land and destroy Israel completely. So they will never take a two-state, like Daniel said in the beginning, that Israel was happy with a lot of these deals, but the Arabs, the extreme Muslims, that's how we can describe them, because that's what we want it to be. Because you don't want all Muslims to believe this, but it is the teaching of the Quran. The extreme Muslims will never accept that, because they are committed to the complete destruction of Israel, and they're not shy about it. They'll say it today on the news in Palestine and all around. So it's not, and we pray for those people, and we pray for the Christians there that are being persecuted by those Arab Muslims, and also to just the whole conflict, and the Jews who are fighting them and dying and not believing in Jesus. As Christians, we're to love our enemies, which includes all of these people, and praying for all of them with eyes wide open. So the issue even for supporting Israel isn't so much theological as it is logical. Just dealing with like, what is the history? Why are they still fighting? There's something that if they stay committed to Islam, that's why they're going to fight, and they're going to keep doing it. So let's keep praying. They're going to do it until the Antichrist brings them peace, which is actually we're going to talk about this next week a little bit. We're going to keep going in those points in chapter 24, because chapter 24 actually talks about that land right there where the Dome of the Rock Mosque is. It's called the Temple Mount Moriah. It goes all the way back to Abraham. That piece of real estate is the hottest piece of real estate in the world. And you see it in the news all the time. So let's pray. Let's just do that. We're going to just do that tonight. And then we'll kind of like carry it over to be continued to next week.